What's up, guys? So last week, Seaboom was able to guess the card art background, which was Devious Cover Up. If you want to be able to beat him, because he seems to win most of these, you're gonna have to turn the notifications on, I suppose. And a while ago, Calamitous Cactus asked us for an Orah sacrifice deck. And we decided to see what we could do. Obviously, the natural response is to just build the Ozolith, because why wouldn't you look at Orah and just think, hey, this is a +1/+1 counter deck, so that's what we did.
What's up, guys? Welcome to the Jank Divers, where we dive into the janky side of Commander. I'm Isaac.
And I'm Brent.
And today, we're building Clerics with counters.
So our commander today is Orah, Skyclave, Hierophant. For 2 and a white and a black, he's a 3/3 core cleric with lifelink. And whenever Orah or another cleric you control dies, return target cleric card with lesser converted mana cost from your graveyard to the battlefield. So pretty straightforward. He's a sacrifice tribal commander that also wants you to run a lot of clerics. So we're doing that, but we also have a little bit of Jank Divers spice thrown in there with it.
So in order to make this work, we needed to find some sacrifice outlets that cared about how big the creatures you were sacrificing were. So we have Eily, Eternal Pilgrim, for 2 mana, a 2/3 with Death Touch, and you can pay 1 mana and sacrifice another creature to gain life equal to the sacrificed creature's toughness. You can also pay 3 mana and sacrifice another creature to exile target non-land permanent. Activate this ability only if you have at least 10 life more than your starting life total. After we've sacrificed a few creatures, we should have more life than 50, so we can start sacrificing other creatures to blow up non-land permanents. Disciple of Grizzlebrand has the same effect. It's a 2 mana 1/1. You pay 1 mana, sacrifice a creature, gain life equal to sacrifice creature's toughness. And Starlit Sanctum, again, has really similar effect. It taps to add a mana to your mana pool, or you can pay 1 white and tap it to sacrifice a cleric, gain life equal to that cleric's toughness, and you can pay 1 black and tap it and sacrifice a cleric to make target player lose life equal to that cleric's power. So in a +1/+1 counter deck, if one of our clerics just gets really big, we can just start repeatedly flinging our clerics at an opponent until they die. Starlit Sanctum, very good if your clerics are getting big like ours are.
So next up, we're going to have some +1/+1 counter synergies, and probably the most important one is the Ozolith. For 1 colorless, a legendary artifact, whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on the Ozolith. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if the Ozolith has counters on it, you may move all counters from the Ozolith onto target creature. So this effectively is going to act as a bank for our +1/+1 counters. So every time we sacrifice one of our big clerics, we can keep those counters on the Ozolith and move them over to a different cleric. Also gives us a lot of board wipe protection. It's very good when typically +1 counter and sacrifice strategies don't really work together. Next up, we have Nikara Layer Scavenger for 2 and a black. It's a 2/2. It has partner with, but we're not running the other partner. It has Menace, and whenever another creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had 1 or more counters on it, you draw a card and lose 1 life. So this gives us free card draw for sacrificing our clerics with counters on them, which is something we wanted to do anyway. And in a similar vein, we have Skyclave Shadowcat for 3 and a black, a 3/3, and then you can pay 1 and a black to sacrifice another creature to put a +1/+1 counter on Skyclave Shadowcat. And whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, you draw a card. So this gives us a nice sacrifice outlet. It also lets us draw cards when we sacrifice clerics, and he puts counters on himself, which is nice.
Next, we have some death triggers that care about clerics specifically, since we did want to build this cleric tribal, because obviously that's what you have to do with Orah. Taborax Hope's Demise kind of just goes perfectly with what we're trying to do. It's a 3 mana 2/2 with flying, and it has lifelink as long as it has 5 or more +1/+1 counters on it. And whenever another non-token creature dies that you control, you put a +1/+1 counter on Torbax. If that creature was a cleric, you may draw a card. If you do, lose 1 life. So it's putting +1/+1 counters on itself. It's seeing when our clerics die, when we sacrifice them. It kind of just checks all the boxes that we wanted in this deck. We also have Relic Vial For 3 mana, it's an artifact. You can pay 2 and tap it, sacrifice a creature, and draw a card. And as long as you control a cleric, Relic Vial has whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. This also checks a lot of boxes. We needed card draw to make our deck work. We needed a sacrifice outlet, and it also helps with our cleric plan. Rotlung Reanimator for 3 mana is a 2/2 zombie cleric, and whenever it or another cleric is put into a graveyard from play, you get to put a 2/2 black zombie creature token into play. Any of our sacrifice outlets that don't specifically say cleric, this lets us double up on sacrificing or just let us build up a really big board, because we can sacrifice quite a lot of clerics due to our commander bringing back clerics from our graveyard whenever one of our clerics dies. So it kind of lets us build like a sort of loop where we get to go down the converted mana cost chain and just build up an army of zombies.
Next up, we're gonna have some ways to put +1/+1 counters on our clerics. First up is Mycaius the Lunarch for white and X, a human cleric, and he enters with X +1/+1 counters on it. You can tap to put 1 +1/+1 counter on Mycaius and remove a +1/+1 counter from Mycaius, put a +1/+1 counter on each other creature you control. So he can put a lot of counters on himself. He can come down early as a 2-drop and get bigger every turn if you don't have anything else to play. And he can spread those counters out across our whole board, and we're going to be having a lot of creatures, so he's really effective in this deck. Next up is Metallic Mimic, a 2-colorless 2/1 artifact shapeshifter. And when it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. You can do what you want, but we'd recommend choosing Cleric. Metallic Mimic is the chosen type in addition to its other types, and each other creature you control of the chosen type enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. I'm sure you can see how this is going to put a lot of +1/+1 counters on our board. Next up is going to be Clerics of Life Spawn for a white and a black, a 2/2 cleric. Whenever another cleric enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. And whenever you gain life for the first time each turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on Cleric of Life's Bond. So not only does he gain life himself for just playing clerics, he puts counters on himself pretty easily as well. And as I'm sure you've noticed, we have a lot of random life gain synergies in this deck, so it's an effect we're interested in anyway.
We also have Cathar's Crusade for 5 mana. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So this gets really crazy and out of hand fast. In fact, Brett and I have not included it in decks just because it's a hassle to keep up with. But it is very, very good in our deck as we have a lot of +1/+1 counter synergies, and we just need our clerics to be big in the first place. And we just have a lot of enter the battlefield triggers. A lot of our cards are creatures, and we have a lot of reanimation and other shenanigans going on where this is just a really powerful effect to grow our creatures really, really quickly. Feast on the Fallen for 3 mana is an enchantment. At the beginning of each upkeep, if an opponent lost life last turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Obviously, in a commander game, this can trigger on each upkeep, so every turn you can technically put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, as long as an opponent's losing life. So this doesn't even have to be damage from you. If one of your opponents attacks a different one of your opponents and they lose life, that'll trigger it as well. Just a really good way to keep counters going. Unspeakable Symbol for 3 mana is an enchantment. Pay 3 life, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So we are gaining a lot of life in this deck just on accident. Paying life to put +1/+1 counters on creatures is not that bad at all. And when your commander has lifelink, you're always going to have a lifelink creature. So paying 3 life to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, if that creature has lifelink, it's going to pay itself back over time. So as long as you can get a couple attacks in or a couple blocks in, you're gonna gain most of that life back really easily.
So next up, we have some ways to proliferate to increase the amount of counters we have on our creatures. First up is going to be Yawgmoth, Thran Physician for 2 and double black, a 2/4 cleric with protection from humans. You can pay 1 life, sacrifice another creature, and put a -1/-1 counter on up to one target creature and draw a card. You can also pay double black and discard a card to proliferate. So obviously free sack outlets are really powerful in sacrifice decks like this, and the fact that it also says draw a card on it and potentially remove creatures from your opposing board, it's just an absolute house of a card, even without the proliferate ability, but that really just pushes it over the edge. Sword of Truth and Justice for 3 colorless equipment. The equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has protection from white and blue, and whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control and then proliferate. Really good when we're just attacking in, because we're going to have a lot of creatures, so attacking is going to be pretty easy for us, and being able to proliferate our entire board of counters at once is just really good. Contagion Engine for 6 mana and artifact. When it enters the battlefield, put a -1/-1 counter on each creature target player controls, and then you can pay 4 and tap it to proliferate. You can put -1 counters on somebody else's entire board and then just slowly destroy them while also buffing up your own board. A +1/+1 counters will really swing the board state in your advantage if you can activate it a couple times.
We also have some Clerics that can resurrect other creatures from our graveyard. This is really good if a Cleric that cost more than one of these die. You can bring back this and then bring back that card. So Whisper for 4 mana is a 2/2 that can tap and sacrifice 2 creatures to return target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. Doomed Necromancer for 3 mana is a 2/2 human cleric mercenary that you can pay 1 mana and tap it and sacrifice it to return target creature card from your graveyard to play. So this is good because it's a cleric, it's sacrificing itself, so it's triggering your commander, and it's bringing back a different cleric to the battlefield as well. Draina, the Last Blood Chief, for 5 mana is a 4/4 with flying, and when it attacks, defending player chooses a non-legendary creature in your graveyard, and then you return that card to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. That creature is a vampire in addition to its other types. It doesn't really matter what they hit. Pretty much all of the cards in our deck are pretty good, and we don't mind having it reanimated. Plus, it gets reanimated with a +1/+1 counter on it, so that's going to help all of our +1/+1 counter synergies along the way, and just give us an extra creature to work with and sacrifice.
So next up, we're going to talk about some of our life gain payoff cards. First up will be Veto, Thorn of the Dusk Rose for 2 and a black. It's a vampire cleric, so unfortunately we're out of creature types to shove Veto into our decks with. And whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life. And then for 3 and 2 black, creatures you control gain lifelink until end of turn. This is especially good with the sack outlets we talked about in the beginning that gain life equal to the creature's toughness, as this converts that into damage. So especially with the repeatable ones where you can pay 1 mana, you can just turn your entire board into just nukes you can funnel at your opponent's face. Well of Lost Dreams for 4 colorless and artifact. Whenever you gain life, you may pay X, where X is less than or equal to the amount of life you gained. If you do, draw X cards. So aside from our big, sacrifice a creature to gain a lot of life effects, we also just have a lot of random little gain 1 life type cards with the Clerics that care when stuff enters and sacrificing things to ping our opponents for 1. We can draw a lot of cards off those effects with Well of Lost Dreams out. And then Heliod, Sun Crown for 2 and a white, a 5/5 enchantment god creature, which is indestructible. As long as your devotion to white's less than 5, he isn't a creature. And whenever you gain life, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or enchantment you control. And you can pay 2 to give another target creature lifelink until end of turn. This lets us put a lot of +1/+1 counters out for free when we're having stuff like Relic Vial gain us 1 life for every creature death, or Cleric of Life Spawn gives us 1 life for every cleric we play.
We also have some really cool cards in our deck that we wanted to mention. Retribution of the Ancients for 1 black mana is an enchantment with pay 1, remove X +1/+1 counters from among creatures you control, and target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn. It doesn't even all have to be from 1 creature. You can just take +1/+1 counters from all the creatures that you have. As long as you have enough counters to equal their toughness, you get to kill that creature. So for just playing our deck, we can just slow down our deck just a little bit to kill any problem creatures, and it's repeatable. So it's just a very neat card in +1/+1 counter decks. Cauldron of Souls. For 5 mana, you can tap it and choose any number of target creatures, and each of those creatures gain persist until end of turn. So what persist is when it's put into a graveyard from play, if it had no -1/-1 counters on it, return it to play under its owner's control with a -1/-1 counter on it. We ran this card because we are a sacrifice deck with +1/+1 counter Subfiend. And what this means is if you have a creature with both a -1/-1 counter on it and a +1/+1 counter on it, both are removed. If your creature gets a +1/+1 counter on it later or enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it, then the -1/-1 counter is removed from it and you can persist it again. So basically every turn you can tap this, give your creatures persist, and sacrifice them all, and then just put a +1/+1 counter on all of them, and you're good to do the same exact thing next turn. So we thought it was definitely a card worth mentioning. The last card here is Etchings of the Chosen. For 3 mana is an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Again, we recommend choosing Clerics for this one, and creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1. So it's just a Anthem effect for Clerics. And you can pay 1 and sacrifice a creature of the chosen type to give target creature you control indestructible until end of turn. So this is a great way to protect our commander, and is also a sack outlet if we have to sacrifice a creature for some reason, and is just an absolute great effect for any of our cards that are just pumping out Clerics, or if we just need to start going down on the beatdown plan.
And finally, to wrap it all up, we have Helm of the Host. You know, it wouldn't be a Jank Divers deck if we didn't put Helm of the Host in it. In case you haven't seen any of our other videos, it's a 4 mana legendary equipment. And at the beginning of your turn, you create a token that's a copy of equipped creature, except the token isn't legendary if the equipped creature was. The token gains haste, and it has equipped for 5. Most of the cards in our deck are really powerful with Helm of the Host. Any of the ones that say whenever a creature dies with a counter on it, you draw a card, very good to get Helm of the Host with, as you can double up on that. You can get a lot of Clerics back with the commander. If you make multiple Orahs, you'll get multiple Clerics back for every creature killed. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with it here. And that's going to be it for Clerics with counters. If you liked the video, we'd appreciate it if you hit the like button and subscribed. Maybe hit the notifications bell if you want to beat C-Boom to the card background art. And make sure to drop your guess for what that card background art is down in the comments, and we'll see you next time.